I'm originally from Wisconsin, and I ended up going to school here at NMSU from 2014 to 2017. So, I got my degree and I wanted to come back to support this city and our region and really help to manage and protect kind of our cultural heritage and the cultural resources of our area. So I wanted to kind of talk about tonight. This is going to be a very broad sort of presentation where I'm going to be talking about how various indigenous groups, specifically like the Mescalero Apache and the Lipan Apache, have used a lot of different important plants and vegetation that can be found throughout the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks. And so I'll be talking about their multiple uses, and also I'll add in a little bit of archaeology to the mix too, because we do have for a lot of plants where they do show up in the archaeological record in one way or the other, thus kind of demonstrating how long people have been using these plants for generation and generation. But also too, just a disclaimer tonight, this is a very, like I said, more general presentation where I'm just the disclaimer is that I'm not advocating for anyone to use these plants in the way he describes, because much of their traditional use would require extensive or expertise knowledge in order to utilize those plants effectively for their uses. So I will kind of jump in. And so what the framework of this presentation will look like is I'll kind of introduce the monuments, the cultural history, what ethnobotany and traditional ecological knowledge is, and also then kind of get into the heart and soul of the plants that we'll be talking about today. So I'm assuming a lot of people are from the Las Cruces area, but maybe there's some people who are not as intimately familiar with the national monuments that basically surrounds the entirety of the city of Las Cruces. So just the very basic background is that our monument has been around for 8 years now. It was proclaimed by President Obama in 2014, and this monument was created out of existing BLM lands. And I think, thank you. If you guys, I'm hearing a little bit of background noise, so just watch the microphones you might have on the backgrounds. Let me go back. That this monument was really this years-long effort of multiple local conservation groups. I'm sure some of you might have been familiar or knew him personally. There have been many conservationists who kind of made this a dream, and it was a years-long effort. David Souls really was kind of a key important person, and we are really kind of sad to add his loss just the other year. And so the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks National Monuments is, so I like to joke to people that the monument exists because of archaeology, because it is through the 1906 Antiquities Act that gives the president the power to proclaim national monuments to preserve their scientific or cultural value. So aside from the cultural resources on the monuments, there are valuable scientific resources such as geologic resources, special species plants, wildlife. And so this monument is really to help manage these very dear and precious resources of the Choya Desert. And so today, we will be talking about plants, not just ones that are confined to the Organ Mountains, but ones that can sort of be found in multiple places of the monuments. And as some of you I'm sure might be familiar, but the monument is not just the Organ Mountains itself, you can see on the map that the Organ Mountains actually only make up one of the units of the monuments, but also like the Petrillo Mountains, the Robledos, the Sierra de las Uvas, the Donianas, but also one that is always kind of missed in the list of mountains that are included in the monuments is actually that southern end of the quote unquote Organ Mountains is actually the northern Franklin Mountains as well, but it kind of got missed in the legislation there. So I wanted to kind of give a very, very broad overview about the cultural history of the land. I could be talking to you guys all night if you wanted to get a much more in-depth picture of kind of the human history that has played out in the monuments. And so as some of you might have heard in the last couple of months, there was a kind of groundbreaking discovery at White Sands where they were able to date a series of footprints to have been over 21 to 23,000 years old. And so that is kind of an incredible find where it has sort of shifted our understanding of how long Native or Indigenous people have been living on this landscape for. But at the same time, in mainstream archaeology, we are actually not surprised because Indigenous people have been telling us forever and a day that they have been living here since time immemorial.
Excuse me, Garrett.
Yes, sir.
This is Ken. I think there are several folks who still have not muted their microphones. If we could ask everybody to mute their microphones so there's no background noise and we can all hear Garrett clearly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I appreciate that.
Sure.
So continuing with that, where in the earliest periods of human history, that people were not settling down in any sort of like permanent villages or settlements, but they were moving across the different landscapes of the monuments on a seasonal basis. Because think about different plants have different availability at different times of year when things come to ripen or they flower at a certain part, or certain parts of a plant become available at different times of the year. So people who have been living on this landscape for generation after generation would move seasonally throughout that land to exploit different sort of plants, materials, and other resources based on the time of year. And eventually, as time went on, people did adopt horticulture or agriculture, wherein they established more semi-permanent and then permanent villages that were focused on farming, maize, agriculture, beans, squash, kind of the three sisters of agriculture. And a lot of what we see in the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks is that these villages usually tended to cluster around the important sources of water, like the Rio Grande, or reliable springs or playas that might fill with seasonal rain. And then usually after people had settled down, we do see like throughout prehistory that there are several droughts, usually that they coincide with 1150, 1300, and 1450 AD. And a lot of these prehistoric droughts ended up sort of acting as the catalyst to a lot of cultural, social, and change throughout a lot of societies. And so by the time that European contact is made by the Spanish in the 16th century, here in our local region, there aren't really any people still living in pueblos, but they had sort of readapted to a more mobile lifestyle. Because think about when you are a farming community, you really have all of your eggs in one basket and you are so dependent on seasonal rainfall. But if you are living a more mobile lifestyle where you're moving across the landscape, you are more flexible in your subsistence strategies or your survival strategies. Because if one place isn't working out for you, or if there isn't any food available, you have that ability to move to a different area and just kind of try your luck again. And so think about the different landscapes of the monuments that, you know, the trios with the volcanic fields that are out there, the organs itself as a sky islands, that just even in this relatively small area, there's a huge amount of ecological diversity that sustains such a wide range of different plant life. And so when I'm talking about Indigenous people, that, you know, when we tend to think of Las Cruces in the region, you know, we don't today have many sort of tribal nations or communities that are sort of surrounding us like it is in northern New Mexico, but still there are a lot of Indigenous communities today that still have connections to the landscape that is the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks, either through ancestral or cultural connections, or that historically part of their lands are now part of the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks. So modern Puebloan communities like Zuni, Acma, Laguna, Isleta del Sur, and Tesuque Pueblo, they all have these connections because, as I mentioned, kind of during these great droughts in prehistory, people tended to move in the region. Not that the region was necessarily abandoned by these people, but people would move out of the region, or they would kind of then live with other people. And what we see is that these prehistoric people, which archaeologists call the Mogollon, that many of those people moved into the Rio Grande to the north and intermarried with the Pueblos that existed there. So a lot of these modern Pueblos, they have ancestors who were part of the Mogollon people in prehistory. And so kind of more historically, as we know that people like the various Apache peoples, the Kiowa, Navajo, and Comanche kind of have more of a historical connection, meaning that we know more from their from historic documentation exactly sort of their interaction and use within the monuments. So like the Kiowa and Comanche, even though we tend to think them more as sort of a Southern Plains people, that the extent of their historical territory and homeland did at one time extend all the way to the Rio Grande here in our region. And also too, the last two Indigenous communities I want to talk about are the Pueblo of Tortugas and the Piramonte tribe of San Juan de Guadalupe. So they are two communities that live here in Las Cruces, but unfortunately they are not a federally recognized tribe, where these people have Indigenous roots and heritage, and they still have very traditional practices that are related to their Piramonte or Tiwa ancestors, but just the political situation is they're not recognized as a sort of tribal or Indian nation in the eyes of the US government. But just think about, like I said, with the monuments, it wasn't a single people, but just this land has had such a rich history that so many communities today have connections to the monuments. And so I know this is a very text heavy slide, but I wanted to invite you all to kind of read some of these quotes from Indigenous community members or leaders in how they relate to the lands, but also how they relate to specifically the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks, because it's where a lot of Indigenous communities today still maintain their relationship or connection to this landscape, because like I said, many see it as the land of their ancestors and still as a landscape that provided food, medicine, and all sort of life-giving sustenance to their people for generations upon generations. And as you see, so we have like Mescalero, we have Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and we have people from Hopi too. And I know there's a little bit of language in their pictographs. So Marilyn Fredericks, she's actually referring to the La Cueva rock shelter at Dripping Springs, which if you all have the ability, you will be able to go there with me on Saturday for the hike. So I don't know if Gil or anyone was going to plug that in at the end, but I thought I would just sort of announce that right now in the slide.
Oh, good. That's fine. Yeah, I was going to say something, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
The more we repeat it, the better.
Awesome. Thank you. But so, like I said, from these quotes, you can see or try to get a better understanding of how many Indigenous communities envision the lands and their relationship to it. Because to put it in a different light is that, and I do hear some feedback from another audio source. So if someone could mute if they're able to.
Susan, could you mute your?
Or does the host have the ability to mute other people properly?
I've never done it before. There's so many new things on this new Zoom programs. I haven't looked at them all.
Okay, I'm just gonna see.
Susan, can you hear me, Susan Brockman? Susan Brockman?
I went right to the left.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So moving on. So I know that I have sort of said this presentation is about ethnobotany, but really what is ethnobotany? It is kind of the cultural study and understanding of how different cultures have used plants in their own cultural life as like food, medicine, clothing, and everything for what they need in their daily lives. But what ethnobotany really is actually traditional ecological knowledge. And so what this is kind of becoming more of a subject matter in environmental studies, wherein as we know, Indigenous people, in a lot of Indigenous traditions, how knowledge is transmitted is typically orally from generation to generation, right? So typically there's no sort of formalized education system, but it kind of is a whole community that teaches the next generation how to live and how to be a member of that particular culture. And so specifically with Indigenous people, like I mentioned before at the beginning of this presentation, that we know at least Indigenous people have been living here for 21 to 23,000 years. So think about all the knowledge that has been passed down from that time through countless generations. And the thing, as of course, like in the past that prior to, let's say, the last half century, is that a lot of Indigenous knowledge or oral history from tribal nations was not given sort of the same standard or given the same respect as a lot of Western science or Western viewpoints, because typically TKE or traditional ecological knowledge was not seen as scientific. But I would challenge that TKE or traditional ecological knowledge is empirically derived knowledge, because this is based on generations and generations of people knowing how to use a plant, experimenting with the plants. And so they are testing it sort of like a scientific method over those successive generations. But two, there has to be this acknowledgement that during European contact and kind of afterwards, when within the US government, it really hasn't been since the late 1960s that the US government has allowed tribal nations self-determination, or sort of live and practice how they see fit. Because, in the centuries before, much of the way was that indigenous ways were seen as inferior, and that there was a need for Native Americans to assimilate into greater European or American society. And so what that has led to has quite a bit of traditional loss of knowledge. And think about, for some tribal nations that who were forcibly removed from their homelands, especially like East Coast tribes that were relocated to Oklahoma. Think about those nations having to be relocated to a new environment that they knew nothing about, or that there was a whole sort of environments that was not familiar to them, and they were sort of separated from their traditional plants that were important for medicine, food, healing, spirituality, ceremony, and the like. And so with that, I kind of wanted to lay this groundwork of, we're going to talk about how with a certain number of plants, how people specifically like the Mescalero Apache and the Lapon Apache have used these to sustain themselves in their daily lives. Because I typically tell people that in the Choya Desert, it is one of the most, if not the most diverse deserts in the world. And so there are so many different diverse plants that have so many different uses for food, shelter, like I said, medicine, clothing. And really the one limiting factor, of course, in the desert is where your water sources are and how you are going to get enough fluids to survive throughout the year. And so I know I'm sort of going to be talking about very general or well-known plants. I know if this was like a 2-3 hour presentation, I would go into like so many more ones, but I wanted to talk about sort of the more common plants and the ones that have a really good amount of ethnographic and archaeological data. So at each slide, I wanted to kind of say too, is that I have the common English name of the plant, and then the Latin or scientific name in parentheses, and then the Mescalero Apache name for that plant is the one that is underneath those. And so Yucca, specifically like soap tree yucca, was one of the most important plants for indigenous people in this landscape, because it had so many different uses. As you see, like for medicine, the roots and leaves could be used to treat insect bites. The flowers, if you were able to boil it enough, you could actually remove the saponins that are within the plant. And also very common to a lot of succulents that are found in the monuments and in the Choya Desert. A lot of the young stalks and stems could be sort of eaten after they were baked, because in a lot of traditional understandings that a lot of these young stalks are prioritized for harvest before the first summer rains come about, because it is said that after the rains, a lot of these stems or stalks become bitter tasting and not very appealing. And of course, with like soap tree yucca, the namesake for the tree comes from indigenous people's traditional use of harvesting the roots and pounding down those into kind of a soapy lather. But Soap tree yucca is, typically found in sort of the lower environments, the desert environments of the monument. So you will see them, on the Bajadas or kind of the lower elevations of the Oregons, in the Donianas, in the Patrios. And so it was a very abundant resource, right? And so now I will kind of get into a little bit of the archaeology. So all of the sort of archaeological artifacts that I'm going to show are actually derived from archaeological sites that are within the Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks. I'm just for the sake of keeping their location confidential, I'm going to be specifically vague as to where these were found or excavated. But as some of you might know that in archaeology, a lot of what we typically find on just the surface of the ground are archaeological materials that can withstand the weathering of time and the elements. So usually like stone tools or flakes, debris, pottery sherds, or other sort of hard materials, but certain organic materials, like ones made out of plant fiber, skins, feathers, and whatnot, really do not have a chance for surviving the ravages of time unless they are in a very dry context. And so usually that translates into caves in our region. And there's only kind of so many. But so for what we're looking at right now, these are actually yucca fiber sandals that were found at a cave in the Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks. And so yucca fiber sandals tend to be like the choice of footwear for people. And there's been caves across the Southwest that it looks like people actually sort of cache or pile up excess yucca fiber sandals, because I would love to do the research to see how long these sandals hold up in your day-to-day. If you have to replace them every 2 weeks, if you're going over rocky terrain, or just, I can't imagine how calloused people's feet were in the past, especially in a desert, if you're going over like broken up malpai, or you're treading through like thorny areas. But what we see is that yucca was preferred, or it was a very abundant sort of source for like fiber cordage to make materials like sandals. And we actually have seen in other archaeological contexts that people actually sort of had like a reference or a template sandal that they would use as kind of a board to weave a new sandal over, so they didn't sort of have to start from scratch every time. And so another thing that have been found in cave contexts made from yucca specifically are kind of these little bags or pouches that you see, like these two examples are naturally dyed. I think there is one type of root for yucca, and I can't say with confidence what yucca species, but I've heard that the root is red and could be used as sort of a natural dye for these. But just if you look at these pouches, just imagine how much skill it took people to kind of weave these materials when all they really have are either bone or stone tools to make these kind of finely crafted materials. And so something like this, pouches could be very utilitarian, like you could carry seeds in that, other sort of materials. And I think you see with the photo on the left of the screen, there's actually might be the remnants of sort of a string on it that would facilitate opening or closing that pouch. And so another thing that we found made of like yucca materials are nets. So sometimes we found nets that are of other materials. Sotal is another very common plant that has been manufactured into fiber cordage, but also surprisingly, human hair has also been a very common material that has been used for creating nets or other sort of materials that you typically would be using plant fiber for. So, but as we know, when the Spanish entered New Mexico, some of the first earlier accounts that we have, when they enter New Mexico, they encounter these group of people who are living between essentially El Paso and Las Cruces, who told the Spanish that they were Manso. And so Manso wasn't necessarily their word for themselves, but it was their word to tell the Spanish that they were friendly. And so the Spanish accounts describe these people kind of living in these not semi-permanent villages, but kind of these seasonal camps, but a great deal of their subsistence throughout the year was from fishing in the Rio Grande. And to a lot of the protein in the past history, what we see in archaeological context, people aren't gorging themselves on deer, but actually think about if you are a prehistoric farming community, one of the most common sources of meat are actually going to be rabbits or other sort of little critters that are going to try to eat your hard-earned crops, right? So what we've seen in the past too, in other contexts, and then from talking to Indigenous people, is that there were some activities throughout the year that small families or kind of extended bands would come together to sort of pool their labor in order to kind of reap a larger harvest. And so in the past, people did create these huge nets that would stretch like, dozens of feet long, where it was essentially similar to a buffalo run, where you would have people at one end of an area flush out all of the rabbits, and those rabbits would then get caught in the nets that these people were holding up at the other ends. And so that, like, rabbit hunts like that were a very important dietary staple for people back then too. So the last kind of archaeological artifact I wanted to show for Yucca is quids. And so this one actually was kind of new to me. I did not know what these were, but in that cave where most of these artifacts are from, this is like one of, if not the most common archaeological artifact on the site. And so you see how small this is. It's only 2 centimeters. So it's basically as small as a wad. And so these are actually sort of the prehistoric equivalent of chewing gum. So Indigenous people would, in some areas, like in our monuments, they would actually chew the leaves or kind of young stalks of agave or yucca, because that is a way to kind of suck away the calories from that particular plant. So it's very interesting that they have bubblegum, but it's not bubblegum, but they did sort of have this chewing for calories while they did other work. Because imagine if you're spending most of your day grinding or pounding down material into a meal, that's quids like this of fresh yucca or agave leaves would sort of help sustain your energy throughout the day. And so shifting to another yucca is banana yucca. And this is one of those plants that is found in most, if not all, of the areas of the monuments. It's pretty widespread. It's pretty plentiful too. And so banana yucca has very similar uses to its cousin, silk tree yucca, but really the kind of big deal about banana yucca are those fruits that are produced. So the fruits are one of the few sources of sort of natural sugars or sweets within the natural environments. Sumac berries are like another one. They're also known as like lemonade berries. But in Mescalero Apache tradition, there was actually a method to pick these fruits before they were ripened, so that you could beat out sort of all the other animals who would be vying for eating up that delicious fruit once it ripened. So what Mescalero Apache people would do is they would take the unripened fruits, spread them out on the ground, and cover them with bear grass so that over time they could ripen in the sun. So it was kind of stealing the fruits away before the animals could get them, but also allowing it to ripen properly or to that sort of edible point. And also, it was used as like a fibrous material that could be crafted into cordage and other textiles or materials. And it is kind of one of the main staples of both the Mescalero and Lipan people. But the next one I want to talk about is agave. So agave Carrii, mexicana, and please, if at any point I'm an archaeologist, not a biologist or botanist, I should say. So if I get any of the scientific names wrong or have some sort of blip in the identification, like please let me know. But what I've seen with agave is people tend to call this like century plant, which there's ornamental century plants around town that are very different, but agave is more commonly known as mescal. And so mescal is the plant that is the namesake of the Mescalero people, which roughly translates into the eaters of mescal, because this plant was really the core of their diet, because it was one of those plants that after being processed and cooked, it could be stored for long periods of time. I believe under proper conditions, the dried cakes of agave could last several years. But also it's one of those plants that is very abundant, especially at higher elevations and kind of more calcium calciferous soils. Especially I've seen agave in parts of the Oregons, but also technically prehistoric trackways or parts of the Robledos that are kind of high enough in elevation and have that proper sort of soil profile. But like most of the plant could be prepared or eaten after proper preparation, because with agave is very much like other species or species of yucca. They have saponins, which is a toxic substance that requires like long baking or soaking to break that down, so it isn't toxic to people. So really the thing that we see in the archaeological record for agave is that people just over thousands of years, really kind of starting in, I want to say 3000 BC up until, historic contact and when indigenous people were put on reservations, that agave, where it was present and abundant, was like such a important part of people's lives that what we see from the record is you see in that picture in the top left. So that is sort of the remains of an agave roasting oven. So what people would do with agave in order to make it edible and store it is that they would carve off the leaves of the agave. So before it would sort of start shooting its stem, because when an agave starts to sprout, it actually starts to lose a lot of its nutrition and flavor, because think about that plant has been waiting 10 years to create that stalk. So all of the nutrition and all of the vitamins and minerals are kind of going into that process of creating that stalk. So people would typically harvest it before, and so with harvesting, they would cut off the leaves and would be kind of left with the heart of the plant. And so what people would do is dig these pits into the earth, line it with different fields, grasses with the hearts, and then also line it with different kinds of rocks that were suitable for retaining heat over a considerable amount of time. because then people would light the pit and then they would cover it up and typically allow those hearts to roast over 2 to 3 days. So if you've ever been to a luau, I have never been to a luau, but it's very similar with like pig in Hawaii. But so when people were done with the baking process, they would retrieve the hearts and then, they have essentially become caramelized. So people could then break those or pulverize those hearts down into this pulp that they would then spread out into these long sort of cake-like figures and allow that to sun dry. And once those cakes were sun dried, that is what I'm saying. That's why it was such a staple of people's lives, is those cakes could last for months, but also it could be eaten right on hand. There was like almost no preparation you needed to sort of make that dry cake edible once more. But of course, people would sometimes rehydrate those cakes to kind of create more of like a mash or mush to eat, and would sweeten it with other sort of natural flavors to improve the profile. But it is one of those staples that provided a decent amount of like carbohydrates, vitamin A, and other minerals. And just to point out in that upper left picture too, so all of this material is, or what we're actually looking at is all of the rocks of that lined pit have sort of been thrown out or pushed out of the center. So in that depression is where the actual cooking pit has been made. And so think about, a lot of these features are being used by Indigenous communities or families for generations. And so to create sort of an oven that big with that many discarded thermally altered rocks, that would take quite a few uses. And you can notice too at the bottom of the picture that there's a lot of carbonized soil too, indicating how much organic material was burned just throughout its period of use. And so too, I wanted to say or kind of loop us back that, I've been talking about uses in archaeology, but that isn't to say that these traditional uses are stuck in the past, that still many of these plants play such an important role in Indigenous communities today in their lifeways, their ceremony. And so Mescalero, still every year, they perform this agave harvest and roast with the community, because it plays very much an important role in their young women's puberty ceremony. And so you kind of see in the picture here, you have young women or young girls throwing sort of the hearts or of the agave into this pit, and you have like the rest of the community kind of sitting around the edges of the perimeter. But it is sort of this communal effort, and I've been very fortunate to be a part of where I have helped the Mescalero Apache tribe identify certain locations on BLM lands, not just on the monuments, but in the greater like Otero, Sierra, Doñana counties, where they would be able to sustainably harvest these materials for agave. And I'm watching my time too, so I'm trying to be good. But so honey mesquite is another plant that had a traditional role within communities. But the thing that we understand with honey mesquite is that its current range is much more expansive than what it was even a few hundred years ago, because when the Spanish and early explorers come into New Mexico and describe the landscape, they typically describe this part of New Mexico as a grassland, and that typically mesquite was really only confined to like arroyos or certain environments, as opposed to being widespread in like sandy environments or dune environments as it is today. So while there is prehistoric or archaeological use of mesquite, it wasn't as widespread of a use as we saw or as we see today. And so mesquite has quite a few uses as well. The kind of my favorite one to talk about is that the beans, once they're ripe, those can actually be sort of ground down into this very protein-rich flour. And so you see in the photo on the right of the slide that the far left sort of powdery substance is what the beans look like after being pounded down into this kind of flour-like substance. But mesquite too also had some medicinal uses, like for earaches, irritated eyes, upset stomachs, and the like too. And another plant that, interestingly, it doesn't have too much use, or not a large diversity of uses, but we know from archaeological context that certain parts of the plant, specifically like charred remnants of the flower buds, have been found in caves or rock shelters and are actually, the flower buds are preferred. But usually what we find in an archaeological context is it seems like cane choya was a moderately used fuel source. So people were just sort of cutting up dead choya and then using that for fires or other sort of fuel related purposes. And then another very common one, it's probably one of the more widespread plants that you see. And I didn't try to identify a specific species of prickly pear because as some of you might know today that there's particularly two kinds of prickly pear, purple prickly pear, and I think plains prickly pear that are able to crossbreed so effectively that it's really hard at times for a non-botanist like me to really know the difference between the two. But still, prickly pear, historically and still today is a very important resource. Like think about, I'm sure in Las Cruces, there are still a few restaurants and places around to this day that you can have nopales tacos or other sort of chopped up pads of the prickly pear cactus. The texture's not quite great for me personally, but this plant is pretty abundant. And not just the pads, but the tunas or fruit of the plants were a very important source of like vitamin C and sugar. And also there were some medicinal uses associated with this plant as well. And what I find really interesting that in that kind of second line that I have is, so I guess because tuna has been such an important resource that people actually crafted specialized tweezers to sort of gingerly harvest the tunas and kind of get around the spiky parts of this particular plant. And so another one that's pretty common in both the archaeological record, but as kind of a main substance, is four-winged saltbush. And so, of course, it lives up to its name because saltbush has been used traditionally as like a flavoring because most of the salt that the plant sucks up is kind of then transmitted, or you're able to taste it within its leaves or other parts of that plant. And so to the seeds, so I do kind of just have a enlarged version of the fruit down there at the bottom, but the seeds could be kind of ground down very similar to like mesquite beans and kind of create a meal-like substance. And that's, if you've been noticing a pattern that a lot of these traditional foods, a lot of them involve grinding things down into kind of drier powder-like substances that could either be made into cakes or kind of mashes or not gruels necessarily, but something that could be easily prepared and be fortifying and enriching. Because it's not where people had extensive ovens or stoves to create like 5-course meals, but they still knew how to properly prepare a meal. But many times it would have to be food that you could cook within a certain time frame, or ones that you're taking from your winter stores or dried food and turning it into some viable meal. And so also, like four-winged saltbush, it shows up in the archaeological record too as a fuel source, or it's being used like firewood, similar to cane choya. And so with all that I said, and that's kind of the end of this very general overview of a few select plants within the Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks. And I kind of I forgot to say with some of them that, you know, a lot of these plants occur within the monuments in different areas, but there's quite a diversity, like I said, in the landscape, where some will be found in certain areas, but others not. But this kind of plays into people moving across the landscape to take advantage of different resources at different times of year, but still too. So in today, traditional plant use is still a very critical part or aspect of Indigenous people's identity, because like I said, it still plays a lot into their everyday life, either through ceremony or as like substance, or the continuation of those traditional uses. And this is something that is not going to change, where it's still going to be part of their traditions until forever and a day. But we have seen with traditional plant use, specifically on the monument, that there have been certain challenges to that continued use. And two of the biggest challenges have been climate change, or, you know, we are in this extended period of drought, as we can feel from like the triple digits this week and looking forward to next week. But, you know, climate change and kind of dramatically differing climatic conditions will possibly and will likely make some of these plant resources more rare, or the environments that once had the ability to nurture and host them might not have that ability in decades along the road. But also there's another threat or aspect to this, where certain commercialization has taken place, not so much here down in New Mexico, but I wanted to share that I have seen in California, there's actually been an issue with traditional communities, traditional Indigenous communities, being able to acquire enough white sage for their own ceremonies, because it has now become more of this mainstream practice to use the white sage for smudging or other ceremonies that are used by non-traditional users, let's say. And so the thing is, like, Indigenous people, where, you know, we, from like a management side, you know, we want to protect and ensure that traditional use, whether it is by Indigenous communities or other communities that might have a use of plants in their tradition, that they're able to do that for generations to come. And we know that a lot of that proper management is allowing for sustainable practices. And that has been sort of a core tenet of a lot of Indigenous communities, is right. And this might be an oversimplification, but it's not to, you know, you don't over harvest things. You're not going to take more than what you need. You're going to take what you need for that season and be secure, but you aren't going to over exploit and then possibly ruin that particular gathering area for your children or for the next season, right? And so just wanted to explain the picture. I think most of you, if you're from Las Cruces, might recognize that. So that is taken at the top of A Mountain, or properly Tortugas Mountain, because still every year the Pueblo of Tortugas has an annual pilgrimage to the peak on the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe in December. And so here you see the two men and people in the background are preparing a traditional, well, that's actually so tall, but they're preparing it as sort of this traditional walking stick that's used during their pilgrimage down from the mountain or to the mountain as well. And so I just wanted to acknowledge too at the end of this presentation that so certain people like Jim Raley, so he is an archaeologist who works for SWCA, but a lot of what I talked about tonight has come from this volume of ethnographic uses of plants, and that was kind of like hosted or produced by the BLM, but also Terry Gregston. So she is a safety officer in the Carlsbad field office, but she is an amazing person, and she has talked to so many Mescalero and Lipan Apache elders and really helped to put this traditional knowledge into the record, just so that those people, those Lipan and Apache people's grandchildren and descendants will have this record for their children. And so also you might have noticed tonight too, a good number of the photos, especially the cover photo comes from Wayne Suggs. And so I believe that was the one he was generous enough to give to us for our use through BLM. But also some of these images come from the Mescalero Apache tribe. And also too, like I said, most of what I have been speaking tonight is traditional use from the Mescalero Apache viewpoint. And to also want to recognize a lot of the photos from the artifacts are from the Harvard Peabody Museum. So it's 8 o'clock, but I wanted to kind of end it and wanted to open this up to any questions or people wanted to have a discussion. So please feel free.
Garrett, may I suggest that if people have a question, that they go to the bottom of the screen to the little icons there, move the cursor down there, and you can see one that's called reactions. And if you click on that, there's a click there that says raise hand. And if you raise your hand, I'll call on you to ask the question, okay?
Thank you, Gil.
My small problem is I can't see everybody in one screen. I don't think I can see everybody in the list either. If I may start out with a couple questions. You called the Ocotillo, no, the choya, a cane choya. Is that the same as a tree choya?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And by the way, I don't know how many people know this. I'm sure there's some, that the yellow ends of the branches on the tree or cane choya have a really strong organic acid to it. Do you know anything about that and whether it was used at all?
So I have not come across a reference for that, but I would assume that if there is an acid that is potentially toxic, that is why people would have baked those parts of the plants. Or is it in the flower bud or is it in the fruit?
Just in that yellow end of the branch,
Oh.
the yellow part, the only
So-
part that is yellow.
Yeah, so
Of course,
that
I don't know
is-
about the rest of the plant because I haven't tested it. See, this is
Sure,
why
sure.
I know it's a strong acid, because I bit into the damn thing and my mouth was sore for 48 hours.
Oh my. Well, I can't say with any confidence because I haven't seen that particular reference about the acid, but it does seem that, yeah, arcane choya had just very limited uses, but it's probably because of that acid that people
Sure,
stayed
sure.
away from that part. Yeah.
Right, and then I wanted to ask you about sotols.
Yes.
Were there any uses for sotol? I missed that if you gave it.
Oh, so I did not have time to incorporate any information about Sotal or Desert
Okay.
Spoon, but it is very similar to the uses found for Yucca. But so it was used as the stems or leaves were used as they could be processed into cordage or textile or some sort of fiber that could be woven. But I believe too that since it is a succulent as well, it could be prepared very similarly to agave in that the core or the heart of the plants could be also baked over long periods of time. But it is interesting that with the communities of Tortugas and the Piedmont Sotila, that's really what I've seen as far as like modern day traditional use of Sotal is making those kind of pilgrim walking sticks.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Yep.
So is there anyone that has any questions? Comments?
Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah,
I have a question.
John, go ahead.
Do you know of any uses that indigenous people made of the datura plants that have the big white flowers in the summer?
Yes, so specifically sacred datura, I'm not familiar with the scientific name, but sacred datura does have a history of use. So it is actually a very potent hallucinogen in that if you are not careful with how the dose is administered of the plants, and it's usually I believe that it's the seeds found in the seed pod that are the source for the hallucinogenic effects, that if you do not carefully watch the dose you take, there is a strong chance you'll go blind. But what's really fascinating is that even though it's really hard to say with confidence from like an archaeological record of its use as a plant for like visions or other sort of ceremonial use, what is interesting is if you all are familiar with Mimbres black and white pottery. So like Western New Mexico State University has a lot of these pots or bowls that were created by Mimbres Mogollon people in prehistory, and it is typically understood to be one of the finest examples of prehistoric pottery throughout the Americas. But what we see is that a lot of the designs on the bowls that at first appear geometric actually are references to how the flower of the datura opens. And so there's kind of, and if you've seen a white sacred datura flower open, it's kind of like it is a very unique sort of swirl on it. And so our art imitates life, I guess, a little bit, but a lot of those designs that we see in those Mimbres bowls reflect what people have seen in the natural environment, like the opening of sacred datura. But two, maybe I'll just, I know this wasn't part of the question, but you know, a more common plant that we do see at places that indigenous people consider sacred or of particular importance, we do see at like rock art sites. And in many cases, there happens to be plants of like wild tobacco or Indian tobacco growing in those areas that just from that context are understood to have played a part in some sort of ceremony or ritual for people at those spots.
Again, thank you, Garrett, for this presentation. Very interesting stuff. And
Great.
we'll see you Saturday. How's that?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm more than happy to do these kind of things. And thank you for taking time out of your evening to listen to me talk about my favorite thing in the world.